Herod the Tetrarch was not a king, but he had much in common with the other Herods. He was a corrupt, immoral man with a nasty, mean streak to him. Though not a king, he was in a position of power. He was what you call a tetrarch, and tetrarch means a ruler of four, one of four. So he was one of four governors in the area, and his particular job was set to oversee Galilee and Perea. That was his quarter to look after. And so, well, he was not exactly a very moral person. He was not exactly Jesus' buddy either, because in Luke 13:32, Jesus refers to him as a fox. A fox, and that's not a comment on his physical appearance. It was rather a comment on his morals and actions, his character as a person. Certainly, he was not one to be trusted. That's the man. That's the bust of the man. But that's Herod the Tetrarch. And while we know that Jesus didn't care much for the ethics and leadership of Herod the Tetrarch, it seems that Herod did not care for John the Baptist either. John was a guy who would tell you how it was. And while he was walking around eating locusts and honey and dressing in wild clothes, baptizing people all the way and calling for repentance of everybody, he didn't hold back when it came to Herod. And that's where he may have said too much. He opens his mouth one too many times and he crosses him, because Herod was already married at this time, and now he has his eyes set on his brother's wife. Whatever happened, he had his eyes set on Herodias. And John crosses Herod and he tells him straight up, "You should not be doing that. It is wrong." And for that, Herodias wanted to have him put to death, but John throws him in jail instead. The original punishment that lands him in jail rather than put him to death does not reflect that Herod was a pushover, but that Herod was worried that a death of a person, if he put John to death, there would be a Jewish revolt, this uprising from the Jewish leaders. But while he didn't like what he had to say, he was strangely, as the Bible tells us, kind of drawn to what he had to say. And so it is that regardless of John's counsel of don't do that, he leaves his current wife, and she is a Nabatean princess. And what's not mentioned in the Bible and what you may not understand in the history here is that this Nabatean princess, she gets away and she goes back to her father. She goes back to her father and tells her father exactly what's going on, and the father is outraged with the decision of Herod to trade wives. And you know what this leads? This leads to a war. And this is a war between these two parties, and Herod gets his tail soundly beaten. He gets beaten by the Nabatean father's army. But that doesn't stop him. Because it doesn't cause him to change his mind or step away from his ways. He marries his brother's wife, Herodias. So you have Herod, and his wife now is Herodias. Imagine how confusing this would be at a family get-together. And now, on top of it all, he has a child, and keep in mind, his child is a stepdaughter, but she is biologically related to him. She, at one point, was his niece. And now she's a stepdaughter. And now you've got this party, and apparently, at this party, she dances for the men, and she apparently puts on quite a show. And I'll save you the details, but you know exactly where this is all going. And in a state of inebriation, Herod is overcome. Herod. See? Herod is overcome with lust for his niece or stepdaughter. And he makes this grandiose promise. And try to imagine him puffing himself out in a state of inebriation. He's got food in his mouth and he's drinking and he yells. That he makes this grand promise: I will do anything you ask. I will grant you anything you ask, including up to half the kingdom. You name it, your wish is my command. And that grand promise made in front of nobles and military commanders leads to a request that I doubt he could see coming down the pike. This young woman, this stepdaughter/niece, apparently didn't know what to request, so she goes to her mom, Herodias. Now keep in mind, Herodias doesn't really particularly care for John because John spoke out about those two getting together. And what does the mom say other than, "Bring me John the Baptist's head on a platter"? Holy cow. And this man of questionable honor, this person of questionable integrity, all of a sudden, by this request, says, I am now going to become a person of integrity. I am going to honor this request. And by becoming a person of honor in his mind, he does a most dishonorable act. Now, it's disturbing and hard to imagine anyone requesting this, but it's harder to imagine the morals and ethics of someone saying, go ahead and carry this request out. But that's exactly what Herod did. The passage says, and because of his oaths and the guests, he did not want to break his word to her. So in spite of all the corruption and all the questionable ethics about Herod, his meanness and trustworthiness issues, somehow for some reason he picks this time is going to be the time I'm going to be a person of honor. And it's a passage that I don't like to read. And if you don't like to read this passage, I don't blame you. If you are uncomfortable with this passage on any number of levels, I don't blame you. If you're asleep, wake up. We're getting close to being done. But what can we take away from this? Of course, what I offer you here is merely my perspective, but I hope you can draw some of the conclusions from me, and I hope that you take this home and think about it and you draw some of your own conclusions. And the first thing that I've discovered is that a leader is not without fault. A leader is not without fault. It seems very obvious to see this. We see this all the time in the Bible of corrupt leaders. Positions and authority where they just feel that they're beyond reproach. And many times we find that people in authority don't have a very high sense of ethics or standards. And it never ceases to amaze me that they rise to the positions they do, and you wonder how they got to that position. But the converse of this is that it never ceases to amaze me that we eventually find out that someone has faults. Anyone has faults, even if they aren't readily visible and even if they are a Christian. And counseling people and talking with people, one of the hardest things for people to understand about a wonderful person is in marriage. All of a sudden, their faults become very, very hard to overcome. Any human has faults, and they carry these faults with them. They make decisions, some helpful and some not so helpful, but we should not be surprised that Herod is corruptible. And that's not to excuse what Herod did, because in light of mistakes, the second point is that an effective leader can admit mistakes or errors in judgment, and they can back down. There's a well-known story of Lyndon Johnson, former president during the Vietnam era. And Lyndon Johnson was stuck right in the middle of this time where we were battling the communist rising. There was an amazing threat to the United States. And Mr. Johnson was battling that, but he was battling another thing on another front. He was battling fear and security. The second battle went on in his head. There's an author by the name of Robert Caro, and Robert is an individual that's doing a biography on Lyndon Johnson. And one thing that Mr. Caro says in his books is that Mr. Johnson was incredibly fearful of looking like a failure. was one of his most well-known characteristics was that he was scared of looking like a failure. He was scared of being like his dad, whom he perceived to be a failure. And so in light of overwhelming obvious evidence that the United States should pull out of this war in Vietnam, Mr. Johnson had a difficult time in doing so because he would be seen potentially as a failure. The author concludes it was Johnson's fear of being seen as a failure that led to his inability to admit that we needed to pull out of war, despite the fact that tens of thousands of men continued to die, and despite the fact that it was the most sensible thing to do. And finally, the last point is that faithfulness can and sometimes will bring about death. As we see from the story of John and with other Christian men and women that make the news, those things that just hurt your heart and you just can't imagine what's going through those men's minds at the end of their life as they are killed for their beliefs. Sometimes your faith will bring about suffering, and sometimes your faith will bring about death. And we don't like stories like this. And the natural inclination is to shut the book or shut the newspaper or turn off the TV or tell the other person, I've had enough. To shut yourself off from the world. And if you've ever read the Old Testament and never been challenged or ever been offended, you want to shut the Old Testament because there's a lot of blood in the Old Testament. And it hurts and offends us when such a senseless death is given at the hands of such weak, corruptible leadership. That right there was where my sermon ended several days ago. And I didn't know where to go with this, and it didn't feel good. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, I was laying in bed, and I had no idea where this was going, but I couldn't leave it on that note. How do we bring it back to Jesus? How do we understand Jesus in this situation? Where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? You only have to read just a couple paragraphs beyond this story. Do you know what comes after this story? It's the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. This tawdry event that leads to one man's innocent death is set in contrast to the remainder of chapter 6. Read on, my friends, read on, because the rest of the chapter is about Jesus feeding the 5,000. And that brought me hope. That brought me perspective. While Herod parties and gets drunk on his birthday with nobles and military commanders, there is Jesus walking with commoners. While Herod is seeking to serve his own lustful desires, Jesus is showing selfless service to 5,000 plus people and selfless service to God. Imprisonment and death and fear come from Herod. But there was life and freedom with Jesus Christ. And finally, while Herod is surrounded by greed and food and wine and sex galore, Jesus and his 5,000 followers found simple satisfaction in 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Could you get any more of a stark contrast? And so that's where I guess we're going to have to leave this. Singing praises to God in the midst of corruption that's inexplainable. In the midst of hate and violence that makes no sense, we lift God up. Singing praises to counter the darkness. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness does not overcome it. Singing praises to the light of the world. In a world that makes no sense sometimes, there is Jesus. There's hope. Amen.